MMA careers rarely get the type of fairy tale endings that most sports often see. Hell, the one we're discussing today didn't even result in a win. But I think as time has gone on, we as a fan base are growing more aware and compassionate towards aging fighters and the diminishing returns they often produce in their final years. Even with that being the case, a lot of the great ones left their gloves in the octagon after a scene that can only really be described as sad. Bittersweet is a word that is often thrown around, but any sweetness we often take comes from the knowledge that another tried and tested veteran is finally saving themselves from taking more damage or producing performances that just aren't up to their usual standard. Indeed, there are outliers, guys like George St. Pierre and Khabib Nurmagomedov, who left the sport at an optimal time for their legacy and overall well-being. But more often than not, we watch as a favorite of the fans gets finished or just looks flat. And even before the bout itself concludes, we're all just kind of accepting the fact that this older version no longer resembles the peak product. So if you're wondering what this video is actually about, watch as I slowly focus in on the target. Mixed martial arts is an incredibly complicated and nuanced sport, and to better understand it, fans often attach labels and tags to these athletes as reference points when they fight. And for the most part, they're pretty accurate. You're fighting a Diaz brother? Hit him with some leg kicks. Up against Marlon Moraes? Go heavy on the pressure. Taking on Donald Cerrone? Just hit him in the liver. The dude drinks beer and he hates it when you do that. Then you have Luke Rockhold, a former champion who had fallen on some pretty hard times. And the labels that were given to him? That's Luke Rockhold. He's a pretty awkward guy. He stumbles in his words more often than not. He's a pretty good grappler, but if you land on his chin with any degree of power, he's gonna fall. And after Michael Bisping caught him with that left hook, Rockhold's prior successes, and there were plenty, were often relegated behind his role as the arrogant champion who was thoroughly embarrassed by the unlikely contender, the more relatable Bisping. The Count managed to springboard his legacy off of Luke's. Yoel Romero then gave him the kiss of death after knocking him out and got a title shot for it. Jan Blachowicz proved that his legendary Polish power was no joke, coining the phrase that would continue on to his own title run. And when Rockhold stepped away from the sport, let's face it, he was kind of a meme. I don't actually partake in that side of the internet myself, but I don't think it's controversial to say that Luke was among the 4 or 5 most joked about high-level fighters in the sport, and it stayed that way despite his 3-year absence from the cage. This guy was a legitimately great middleweight in his day, a guy who bet Jacare Souza, Chris Weidman, Michael Bisping, Lyoto Machida, Tim Kennedy, and his first 5 wins in the UFC, which came consecutively, were all finishes. All fights that displayed Rockhold as one of the most deadly and well-rounded BJJ fighters around. But if I'm being totally honest, the criticism and flack that he caught because of his arrogance, because of the holes in his game, because of his dismissiveness of Michael Bisping, yeah, I do think it's pretty fair. What I love though, and what I think is a total testament to this sport's weird and wonderful way of working, is how quickly people started to get on board during UFC 278 Fight Week. Something was just different about Rockhold. In his interviews, he seemed more concise with his words, displaying a real edge and anger at his standing in the sport and how the UFC had treated him in recent times. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to let us know in the comment section below, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the like button if the mood strikes. Anyway, back to the video. You have to remember, this guy was out since 2019, and during that time, the overall legacy of his meme had only grown. YouTube compilations of his stuttering interviews were constantly being uploaded and shared and widely laughed at, people laughing at what they saw as the onset of CTE. And trust me, I know that's not everyone, and I also know that you open yourself up to this kind of response when you're a public figure. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that during UFC 278 Fight Week, Rockhold seemed different. He seemed fired up, and during the week's media run, he spoke angrily about Dana White and the UFC, letting everyone know just how insulted he has been by the company's management of their fighters' well-being. He had spent the last 3 years out of the sport, and who knows what he discovered about himself during that time, but whether his awkward interview demeanor was simply a result of awkwardness or actual brain damage, it can't have been easy for Luke to have that label so firmly attached to him, especially when he wasn't finding any degree of success in the cage. The old Rockhold came across as a bit of a tryhard, too cool for school and quite difficult to latch onto. But what I saw during the build-up to UFC 278 from the fans was less and less comments about how Paulo Costa was going to down him with one punch, and more slightly embarrassed fans admitting quite publicly that they kind of liked this new Rockhold. And I certainly count myself among the latter. This Luke Rockhold wasn't putting on as much of a front. Sure, he was being himself and all that entails, but the venom he was projecting all week week seemed a lot more genuine and absolutely did not go unnoticed. When the fight itself came around, the resulting contest was like watching a high-octane therapy session. Luke seemed to be somewhere between not wanting to be there at all and totally determined to show the world that he was not who they believed him to be. His chin somehow looked better. There was a swagger to him, not one born out of arrogance so much as it was pure stubbornness. He knew he was bowing out of the sport, and he was not going to lie down and become another addition to Borrachinia's highlight reel. I love this fight. I love the energy of Luke Rockhold's performance, especially considering what was on the line for him and how he just managed to tough it out. It was no technical masterclass, don't get me wrong, and Paulo Costa was clearly the better, more prepared fighter of the two, but to see Luke Rockhold shut his doubters up like that, even in defeat, that for me was special, the type of U-turn you don't often get to see in this sport. MMA is quite cruel and its fans can be merciless, and I think that even though he didn't win the fight, Luke Rockhold left the UFC with a level of respect that I just didn't expect him to ever attain. A great fighter whose career was memorable, and I guess I'm just happy and somewhat relieved that this retirement didn't leave me feeling as empty as most of them do. Luke Rockhold exited the sport with the respect of the masses, the type of respect that you can certainly edge towards on the mic, but it is a respect that has to be earned in the cage, and I think that will colour his legacy in a much brighter shade than if he had retired back in 2019. While indeed he did lose, the statement he was making all week served as an almighty middle finger to all his doubters, and hey, I'm happy to take that. So yeah, that'll just about do it for this video, and I suppose my main question for you guys is just how much this performance did for your own stance on Luke Rockhold. If you were a hater before, did he finally earn your respect? Do let us know in the comments section below, and if you want to like the video and subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. As always, thank you for watching.